Our reading is Acts chapter 24. 5 days later, this is after Paul has been taken from Jerusalem and delivered to Caesarea, where it's judged he'll be safer. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about these charges that we are bringing against him." The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. Now, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues, or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. Now, after an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or those who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing that I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings, and when Lysias the commander comes, he said, "I will decide your case." And he ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. And as Paul talked about righteousness and self-control and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. And when I find it convenient, I will send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. And when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. And we'll turn to those words in a little while. Well, we turn now to Acts in chapter 24. And I think we have 3 more sermons on Acts, and we're done. Yeah, and we'll move on to something else. But still, it has been such a blessing. And this is an interesting passage that we're looking at today, and there are a few points I want to note before we get into the text. First of all, this trial before Felix is the most detailed account in Acts of a court sitting. It's interesting. There is a plaintiff, the high priest and the elders. There is the defendant or the accused, that's Paul, and there is the judge, that's Felix. And even the charges brought against Paul are presented by a legal advocate, a lawyer, Tertullus. It also recalls the trials of Jesus by Jews and then Pilate, and anticipates Paul's ultimate trial in Rome. I suppose it's therefore a living illustration of Christ's words that if they hated me, they will hate you also. And I can't help feel that when I read these trials, because again and again and again through Acts, Paul is placed before people who grill him and accuse him and threaten him, until we know finally he reaches Rome, where all of that comes to pass in the most final way. And so for you and I think this matters. You see, if church isn't to be just a harmless social pastime, that I think a lot of people would consider it, it must share the gospel. And it must share it as soon as it can. Because very quickly, as for Jesus and Paul, it will begin to cost when we do that. And so if it's costing you to share the gospel with someone, don't be discouraged. If you bumped into a New Testament Christian, they'd be able to identify with you. They'd know exactly what you're going through, because they would have felt the same. And so characters like Paul, if you like, who stood above the parapet and who we remember today, they came in for quite a grilling, quite a beating, and then ultimately often lost their lives for the cause of what you and I hold dear. So don't let this church and our coming together on Sundays become a harmless social pastime. I mean, my goodness, that is the biggest insult that anybody could level against us, isn't it? It's got to be. And we should note, too, the insincerity of Paul's accusers in their praise for Felix. I mean, they say they've enjoyed a long period of peace under him, and oh, Felix, we are so profoundly grateful for it. But one historian and scholar says this moves beyond any reasonable perception of reality. Because during this man's reign, if you like, there were many revolutionary uprisings, not peace at all. And he himself was ruthless in his dealings with the Jews, who were certainly not grateful. And Jewish contemporary historian, Josephus, he actually says that the Jews were not grateful. This man was a tyrant. They couldn't wait to be rid of him. And yet they stand to accuse Paul, and frankly, they'll say anything. Oh, Felix, you're wonderful. You're so wonderful. But let us just tell you about this guy, Paul. Honest to goodness, this is simply lying flattery. That's what that is. It's lying flattery. And who knows, maybe Felix was wise enough to realize what a load of waffle, they were speaking. And it's a reminder that for you and I, to resort to distortions and exaggerations of truth is a downright lie. And it immediately places us in a camp that God is not pleased to honor. And so when we're sharing the gospel with anyone, we must let our yes be yes and our no be no, and speak the simple truth. We live in a day, my daughter tells me, when everybody's bigging everything up. Nothing's ordinary anymore. Nothing's straightforward anymore. And all our advertising and our television, everything is being bigged up to such an artificial, inflated high that you start to wonder, is there any truth anywhere? Is there anything normal anymore? Because everything seems to be so superlatively wonderful. But we need to be honest in our sharing of gospel truth. We are to let our yes be yes and our no be no. Speak the simple truth. It may not impress the crowd, but God is. God is in it. And what a challenge in our day when so much is fraught, as Diana said. Isn't that right? Wasn't it, Diana? That so much is just froth and bubble. Let's be honest and straightforward and simple and plain talking and allow the truth to be the power that we know it actually is, and not the way we formulate it or how we try to excite people. And I need to remember that as a pastor and avoid embellishments and distortions and exaggerations. The gospel is powerful enough. It doesn't need dressing up. How important that is to get. Well, let's now examine this passage and learn what the Spirit teaches us in it. First, notice the charges made against Paul. They're in the first 9 verses. The lawyer Tertullus accuses Paul of being a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews as a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and trying to desecrate the temple. These are the accusations. Now, a few points. First, if these charges are true, and I'm trying to create the setting for this, if these charges are true, Felix absolutely must respond. Tertullus is charging Paul with inciting social unrest. Now, for Rome to hear about this, and Felix not to have responded to it, would be disastrous. We have to remember that while Rome boasted the Pax Romana, and the Pax Romana was peace throughout the empire, this was Rome's boast. It had brought peace to the world. You know, the Pax Romana, though, only existed because Rome's instrument for preserving peace was a state-sponsored violence that no group and no member state could possibly survive. Felix was in high office, but it came as a cost. And so the charges against Paul are serious. If Felix ignores Paul, and Paul goes out and creates a whole load of social unrest, and the emperor back in Rome and the Senate get to hear that he had the opportunity to bring this to an abrupt end, and he didn't take it, then he himself could lose his life. It's quite an extraordinary how it was. Rome maintained the Pax Romana. And it's important for you and I to know that. But secondly, while the allegations will be defended by Paul, and I think this is a much more important point, it has to be admitted the gospel preached and the gospel believed is incendiary. Now, I don't know, do you know what I mean by incendiary? Well, when I lived in Northern Ireland as a child, we were hearing about incendiary devices all the time, because they're the thing that makes the bomb go off. And the gospel was incendiary, and it is incendiary. You see, elsewhere in Acts, the gospel, we're told, can turn the world upside down. The gospel is like throwing a grenade into the middle of a setting in which, when it goes off, and once it's heard, and once faith engages with it, it transforms life. And why? Well, you know, it exposes our radical sinfulness. It warns us of judgment to come. It exposes the empty religiosity and imagined benefit of good works as powerless to save us. And so what it brings us to see is our own spiritual bankruptcy before God. And that's why I say the gospel is incendiary. Because when you roll that grenade in among someone and they come to understand it, then it breaks down all that shell of imagined religiosity. It breaks down all that shell of our felt self-righteousness and acceptance before God. It actually destroys us. It brings us to the place of our own spiritual bankruptcy. And of course, when it does that, then we cry out to him to be saved. And that's why the gospel is a grenade. When it's rolled up to us and explodes, as it were, its truth upon our lives and exposes our weakness and brokenness and need before God, we're left with nothing to do but call out to God and cry out to him. And thank God those that call out to the Lord are saved. That's the promise of the gospel. Those that cry out to the Lord are saved. You see, often the last to accept this are the religious establishment. If you think about it, the religious establishment and the religious individual is often the last person to accept this, but the first to accept it are prostitutes and tax collectors. Why? Because they know they're sinners. And this is the extraordinary thing about the gospel. You know, some here have had their worlds turned upside down by the gospel because it has exposed the emptiness and the thinness and the paucity of our own spirituality and made us and moved us to cry out to the Lord and know and save us and strengthen us and comfort and encourage us. If we still are under the impression that we have anything of ourselves to commend us before God, we've never heard the gospel. Now, don't get me wrong, we've heard a lot of religious words. We've probably heard loads of sermons. We might even have been to some Bible study. We might have read some amazing books. But if we are still left with feeling there is anything about us to commend us before God, we have never really heard the gospel. Because the gospel points out to us first our utter moral and spiritual bankruptcy before God, to such an extent that then we realize our only help is to be found in calling upon the Lord. And when we do call upon the Lord, we find he draws near and transforms and changes and blesses. And that's just a wonderful thing. I can't preach that enough, because that's the most important thing. You know, it's not if you spend long enough in church you're bound to become Christian. Not at all. You can spend years in church and become harder and harder and harder and more desensitized to the gospel. That's a possibility. But when the Spirit takes the gospel and exposes our true selves by the gospel, then we are made to cry out to the living God and know his salvation and know what grace is and why it's amazing. And that's just, you know, hallelujah. Hallelujah that we have a gospel. If your heart has been made sensitive to God, you'll know what I'm saying and you'll know that it's true. Hallelujah. But moving on, in response to the charges brought against him, notice the defense that Paul made. It's in verses 10 to 21. Notice, first of all, his honesty. Notice Paul's honesty. Tertullus flattered Felix, but Paul makes a simple, factual point. In verse 10, he begins, I know that for a number of years you, Felix, have been judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Now, in the conventions of the day, not to acknowledge Felix's authority would have been insulting. And Paul doesn't want to insult him, and so he mentions his authority. But there's no flattery. There's no lies. He'd rather be truthful before God than lie to Felix. He even says in verse 16, I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. And so should you and I. As I've said previously, at every turn, strive to keep our consciences clear before God and man. When we're speaking to somebody about the gospel, I want to be able to walk away from that encounter and feel that before God I've been honest, that I've been true, that I've been straightforward and plain speaking in the delivery of the gospel and what it is I believe and the reason for the hope that is within me. But then secondly, as to specific allegations, Paul is clear that first, he was not involved in any argument or stirring of crowds. Secondly, he only went to the temple to make offerings and to worship. And thirdly, his presence in Jerusalem was to bring offerings to the poor. And so if he is guilty of the things brought against him, Paul invites his accusers to witness, to bring witnesses to that effect. Find them, bring them in. But Paul does something else, and this is what I find deeply interesting. He does something else in his defense, which is not only honest, but strategic. He admits two things. First, he says that he's a follower of the way, which they call a sect. In other words, he admits that he is a follower of Jesus Christ, that he is a disciple of his, and he doesn't shy away from that. But secondly, he admits that he believes in the resurrection of the dead. And in verse 15, that there will be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. And so it's clear that what Paul is doing is actually turning his defense speech into a testimony to the work of God in raising Jesus from the dead. And so Paul is defending himself, but his goal is not to win an argument, but to advance the gospel. How vital for you and I to see this, because it's a key point in this passage. Our calling is not to vindicate ourselves. Our calling is not to stand before others, to share something of our faith in Jesus Christ, and to go away with them feeling better of us. That's not the point of it. Our calling is not to vindicate ourselves or even prove others wrong. It's simply to share the good news of Jesus Christ. That is our calling. Now, of course, we will try to do the former, but it's the latter that is the main thing. The gospel is the main thing. When Paul gets to Rome, he won't prove his accusers wrong, and he won't vindicate himself in their eyes, but he will spread the gospel. And from that place, the gospel will be spread to the furthest extremities of the empire and the earth. And so how vital to remember that we will not always come out of every gospel-sharing episode more appreciated, more admired, or more valued. You know, as John the Baptist intimated, his increase will probably be accompanied by our decrease. And so how important it is to get that from the outset. What does it matter, says Paul in Philippians, if Christ is preached? I don't really matter. It doesn't bother me how people see me, as long as the gospel is preached. And this is an extraordinary episode, because if you think of the challenges and accusations that are made against Paul, while he addresses them briefly, he launches into an exposition of the resurrection. Now, why would he do that? It's not going to advance his case. People aren't going to listen to a story about the resurrection. They go, yeah, okay, Paul, you're all right. You haven't done anything wrong. Because the resurrection has nothing to do with him being before these people. But what he's actually realizing in his own head and heart, that I could defend myself before these people. I could get away with this situation, but I haven't said a single word about Jesus Christ, having died for sin and risen again from the dead to save all that call upon him. And so it is with you and I. Our calling is not to convince people of our worthiness and you know how great we are. It's to convince them of the worthiness of Christ and how great he is to save all that call upon him. And can I say, if the New Testament is anything to go by, our own reputation will suffer. They will, because that seems to be the way of it. But Paul's preaching of the resurrection of Christ, and in time the resurrection of the resurrection of the wicked, was undoubtedly a challenge to the faith. That made them stop. That made them think. Now let me explain why, and this is the third and final point, so bear with me. We're going to look now at the message of Paul to Felix and Drusilla. It's in verses 22 to 27. Now it's clear that Felix is intrigued by Paul. There's no doubt about it. He has already looked into this new sect, and he clearly can't dismiss it. He suspends making a judgment and has Paul put under house arrest, but he does more. He and his wife Drusilla call for Paul, and they listen privately to what he has to say. Now, can I say, that will not have been easy listening. Paul spoke in verses 24 and 25 of faith in Christ and righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. And we read, Felix was afraid. Now, how extraordinary that Paul is awaiting sentence, and yet Felix is the one who is afraid. Why do you think Felix is afraid? Why do you think Drusilla is afraid? These are the kind of questions I guess would be asked in a history lesson. Why are they so afraid? If Paul's talking about righteousness, judgment, what's going on? Well, what's actually happening is this, and maybe it's understandable. You see, Josephus, this contemporary Jewish historian, calls Drusilla a transgressor of the ancient law. Imagine your reputation doing that, a transgressor of the ancient laws. She was known as that, a transgressor of the ancient laws, because she just up and left her husband for no other reason than to marry Felix. Felix himself was so brutal, his name has gone down in history as being vengeful, wicked, cruel, a kind of bloodthirsty kind of man who I said earlier pounced on every uprising and every revolutionary movement in Judea. And what are they hearing? Righteousness and judgment. This is why they are afraid. She had a terrible reputation, and he was no saint. But I want you to notice something to finish, that they are not without hope. For all his brutality, and for all her lack of fidelity and adultery, they neither of them are without hope. For Paul preaches to them faith in Jesus Christ. This is an extraordinary thing. So, going back to the courtroom scene with which we began, this reminds us there is another and higher court spoken of by Jesus and his apostles, in which every one of us will be tried. Every one of us in this room will be tried, for we are all Felixes and Drusillas. Now, isn't that shocking? I painted Felix and Drusilla in the most awful moral colours, but we are all of us Felixes and Drusillas. We are all transgressors of the ancient laws. And on that day we will all stand where the accused stands. And the sins of each of us will be read out. And the judge will listen, and judgment will be passed. This will happen. This isn't Kieran's idea. Believe me, I would not include this if I were given the opportunity to import my ideas into the text. I would have us all going to Tenerife and giving deck chairs and pina coladas. I wouldn't have this. But these are not my ideas. These are the Lord's ideas. After death, judgment. After death, judgment. Where every Felix and every Drusilla and every transgressor of God's law will be there before the court. But what the gospel does is invite us to imagine that just before the final sentence is read, the judge's son steps forward and takes our place as the accused. And when the judge, his father, reads out our sentence, your sentence and my sentence, the son receives it on behalf of us all and takes it to the judge. That's why even a wicked king and a horrendously unfaithful Drusilla could still receive preaching and instruction on faith in Jesus Christ. It wasn't because Paul saw something in them that was winning and redeeming. It wasn't because he noticed a quality in them that he felt was salvageable. It wasn't because he'd heard they visited the synagogue very often and were quite religious people, because all of that is dross before God. It was simply this, that when the sentence was read out, Jesus came and received it and took it to the cross and died for the sins of us all, that we might be forgiven and that we might be restored and accepted to the Father. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever receives him will not perish, but have everlasting life. And that is what Paul tries to get Felix to understand when he's speaking of judgment to come, and also of faith in Jesus Christ. For Jesus said, for God did not send his Son. This is Jesus. Listen to what Jesus is saying to us. God did not send me into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. Whoever believes in me is not condemned. They are the words of Jesus. And Paul says the same thing. After his fullest explanation of the cross as a substitutionary atonement for human sin, Paul says that for believers, there is therefore now no condemnation for those that are in him. Isn't that great? Isn't it amazing that Felix and Drusilla have a hope? I mean, their life has been the most extraordinarily poor effort, and yet they have a hope. And where does it lie? It doesn't lie in themselves. It doesn't lie in their achievements or lack of achievement. It's as though, sin and good works almost don't matter, because the important thing is that another has acted on their behalf and lived the life that they failed to, and then died the death, as I say often, they deserve to. And can I say, it's only by engaging with God, it's only by calling out to God to forgive us on the grounds that his Son has died out of, that a person is forgiven and accepted into the kingdom. Hallelujah. I've said too much, but hallelujah, what a gospel. I don't want a single person leaving this building this morning thinking that in any way themselves or their performance or their credits or their debits or whatever will impact their security before God, because your security before God is in Jesus Christ, who came and, as I've said too much, lived your life and died your death, that you might be acceptable to the Father. Now, did Felix and Drusilla accept this? There's no evidence of it. Absolutely not. But I hope there is no evidence that you reject it. Because this is our Lord, this is our Savior. Hallelujah. Jesus is great. So, Father, we thank you for your word, and we just pray that it will find a place in our hearts, that we, Felixes and Drusillas, might know that our only hope is your word. So be with us now, we pray, and encourage us as we sing our final